Stephen Orlins has witnessed changes in China-U.S. relations under 4 U.S. presidents, and he has been the president of the National Committee on United States-China Relations since 2005. In a recent survey, he said that U.S. foreign policy has become too hostile on China. What did he mean by that? What can both Chinese and U.S. governments do to improve the most important bilateral relationship in the world today? I'm pleased to be joined by Mr. Stephen Orlins himself, President of the National Committee of the U.S. China Relations. Mr. Orlins, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. It's a critical moment, very interesting and very intensive diplomacy being carried out between China and the United States over the past few months. So I want to ask you, where do you think we are in terms of bilateral relations, having gone through the very tumultuous few years under President Trump and the first year under President Biden? Where exactly do you think things are?
Well, first, let me start off by saying how much I miss being in China. That this is the longest period I have not been in China in 42 years. 42 years ago, last month, I arrived in China, and there has never been a period that I've been outside of China for 2 years. It will now be 2 years since I visited, and I miss my friends. I miss seeing you in person. I miss I miss so many things about China, and it's
Likewise,
a time when
likewise, the feelings are shared here.
It makes me there's almost a sadness when I have meetings now. I do so much by Zoom, but it's different from being in person. I think the good news is we hit rock bottom, I think, prior to the release of Meng Wanzhou. That the release of Meng Wanzhou has led to the release of the 2 Michaels from Canada, led to the release of the 2 Liu children, led to a more productive conversation between Yang Jiechi and National Security Advisor Sullivan, led to the Xi-Biden virtual meeting, led to an agreement with respect to Chinese state media in the United States, and hopefully the return of U.S. journalists to China, led to the release of simultaneously by America and China of oil from our strategic petroleum reserves. So we're starting to slowly build in very small ways habits of cooperation. So we hit rock bottom. Rock bottom may have been the meeting in Anchorage, which was very, very, very contentious and didn't seem that there was a good path out. Now we're making slow progress on a number of issues. Janet Yellen and Ambassador Tai, Catherine Tai, are speaking with Liu He, so maybe we'll see some progress on the economic front. So things are better. They're slightly better than they were, but they're in no way, shape, or form good. They still are deeply, deeply troubled for a whole variety of reasons. And there are lots of things that both governments can do.
Yes. Well, you certainly are one of the veteran and prime witness of the growth of this bilateral relationship. So according to your observation, what contributed to relationship hitting a rock bottom? And what do you think are the factors that brought it back, at least apparently by now, to seemingly the right direction, at least?
Well, it's very minimally the right direction. I mean, again, we kind of scraped the bottom, and now maybe we're kind of coming off the bottom with these small kind of progresses that I enumerated. I mean, it slowly fell apart for a long time, based upon policies by the Chinese government, based upon policies by the U.S. government. I mean, it started, when you go back to the Obama era, the people in the U.S. government were deeply frustrated that we keep talking with the Chinese, but nothing ever got accomplished. China's activities in the South China Sea, the Obama administration believed were violations of international law. We kept talking about it, but progress wasn't made. The business community believed that Chinese companies were stealing intellectual property and the Chinese government was abetting that theft. And that caused the business community to stop being supportive of constructive relations. The diplomats began to feel frustrated. Then, of course, so all these building frustrations. The people who were supportive of constructive engagement in the United States are no longer speaking out. Again, the Chinese government, against my advice, passed this international NGO law 5 years ago. And a pillar of constructive relations were the NGOs that were in China, that foreign NGOs, there were 6,000 of them, 5,990 were very supportive of China, maybe 10 weren't. But rather than dealing with that 10, a whole new law was passed, and a number of NGOs who were supportive of poverty alleviation and of other things have left China. And this has been another pillar of constructive relations that has kind of fallen by the wayside. Then Trump was elected, and then, the bottom fell out. He had the narrative that China has simply taken advantage of the United States. He viewed trade, if you sell me something, you win and I lose. Even though when you sell me something, I get something and you get some money, we both win. But he was able to kind of convey this narrative that Americans have lost as a result of U.S. China relations. Then after the first year of kind of it was okay. It was kind of hanging in there. Then the bottom fell out of the relationship and everything became contentious. We had a phase one deal that didn't really do much for America, didn't do much for China. And when the Biden administration took office, relations were at a low. The Trump administration was constantly talking about things which they said the Chinese government was doing that they weren't doing. So they said, China's interfering in the U.S. elections. Well, now that we've investigated it, that wasn't the case. Russia did interfere, but China didn't. But that became kind of part of an accepted narrative. China, these tariffs that we have in place now, China pays those tariffs. No, they don't. American citizens pay those tariffs. The people who buy goods in the United States pay those tariffs. So we really reached a rock bottom. We no longer could kind of counter the narrative that constructive relations benefited the American people and benefited the Chinese people. So the Biden administration was left with this incredibly toxic environment with respect to China and the United States to try and do some productive things that benefited the American people. Similarly, the narrative in China was equally bad about the United States. That is a very harsh narrative. America was trying to contain China. America was doing all of these things to China. So you had narratives in both countries that really were negative. And that's when we hit rock bottom.
Yes, so you mentioned a couple of points. I don't think it is constructive at this moment for me to counter point by point, to what you have said about China, because from the Chinese perspective, China also had all kinds of reasons and rationalization why China were doing what it were doing, in what it believes under its jurisdiction. And of course, these actions will have reactions from the United States side, and then slowly things build up. But I really want to look at, the lessons that can be drawn from, the tumultuous times we just came through, and what can be taken forward so that the same mistakes do not get repeated. Right now that we are facing this very minimal window of opportunity, let's say?
I think we have to develop what I call habits of cooperation. So we have to, and it's very difficult given the strategic tension that exists between the United States and China to deal with the very big issues. But there are lots and lots of smaller issues that we can deal with, the United States and China can deal with jointly and create what are these habits of cooperation. So the journalists, so what I've been advocating with respect to the journalists, CGTN, Xinhua, and others, be granted visas to remain in the United States, that we treat Chinese state-owned media the way we treat other media. The Chinese government needs to re-invite American journalists back to China. Is this a huge deal? Is it going to fundamentally change the narrative on U.S. China relations? No, but it is going to create a better environment for the United States and China. The consulate closings. If we reopen, allow the Chinese government to reopen its consulate in Houston, and China allows us to reopen the consulate in Chengdu, is it going to fix U.S. China relations? No, but it creates a habit of cooperation. If we end tariffs that Trump put in place, China will end the retaliatory tariffs. Is it going to get rid of all the problems? No, but it's going to be good. And the Chinese people and the American people are going to benefit. We now have a new variant of COVID, the Omicron variant, which is a real threat to the world. I'll come out with something with calls on both the United States and the Chinese government to cooperate on pandemic prevention, on dealing with this new variant. And it's something which people in both countries, first of all, scientists want to cooperate. American scientists, American doctors, Chinese scientists, Chinese doctors want to cooperate. But if we can cooperate and we can say to the American people and we can say to the Chinese people, you see that when we work together, we can save people's lives. So again, is it going to fix U.S. China relations? No, but it's another, what I call a habit of cooperation. And there are lots and lots of things which have been undone in the past that need to be reconnected so we can start having better relations again. And then in time, it's like when you have a problem in a marriage, you can't fix it overnight. But you start working on the little things. And then when you fix the little things, then you get to the bigger thing, the medium-sized things. Then you get to the bigger things. And guess what? Then you have a good marriage again. So I'm constantly talking to the United States government. You know, the release from the release from the strategic petroleum reserves. It's not a big deal, but it's a habit of cooperation. It's like in 2007 and 8 when we had the financial crisis. The U.S. and China cooperated to bring the world back. Today, it would be very problematic for us to try to do it. So I'm arguing with both governments every night saying, you know, let's do this little thing, let's do that little thing. Because if I try to talk about the big things, you know, everybody wants to ask me, how do you define the relationship? I said, well, it's really hard to define today. But we're at a point where we can make progress. And I'm constantly telling both governments, please do this, please do that. And we're making some progress. We're making progress.
It's really interesting. Not enough, yes. It's really interesting to hear you talk about this because in Chinese we have this saying, 不以恶小而为之，不以善小而不为, meaning don't think that evil is small so you can do it, but don't think that a good deed is small so you don't do it. And I've heard people in the know, people in policy making or influential people who talk about this for U.S. China relations, and it's very much in the same line with what you just said. Let's start from the small things, and bit by bit, maybe the atmosphere can turn around. And we saw actually concrete benefit, concrete action being or agreement being reached during the virtual meeting between the two leaders. For instance, the agreement on the journalist thing, exactly what you said. So what has been the reaction when you talk to policymakers in Washington or scholars there? What has been their reaction to this approach of building a habit of cooperation? Because you said that, you know, U.S. policy on China has been too hostile. Do you think there is enough reception of your idea of starting small and slowly building up?
You know, a lot of people have asked me about that article in Foreign Affairs, which put me in a distinct minority within the United States. And I thought back, I said, gosh, you know, there are two times in my life when I've really been in the minority. One was early in my career in my opposition to the war in Vietnam, that I believe that American participation in the war in Vietnam was wrong and we should withdraw and end the war. And slowly the American people came around to the view. So I started in the minority, I ended up in the majority. The second time was my opposition to the American invasion of Iraq. I believe that it was done in violation of international law. I believe that there wasn't sufficient proof that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and I opposed it. Now, guess what? 30 years, 25 years later, we look at it and we say, well, I had some real facts on my side.
So is this the third case that you're in a minority?
Well, this is the third case. I'm in the minority, but I think, look at the people who are in the minority. Ambassador Stapleton Roy is with me. Lee Chung of Brookings is with me. Jeff Bader, former Assistant National Security Advisor, is with me. People who have all lived in China and understand. They're really the Zhihua Pai. They're the folks who know China. And so I'm very comfortable with that. And I believe that if we keep arguing, so what I argue in the United States is these things that are done benefit the American people. So if we end tariffs and Chinese end tariffs, yes, it also benefits China, but it benefits the United States. It benefits the American people. It especially benefits lower income Americans. The Congressional Budget Office has said that, the tariffs are costing the average American family $1,200 a year. Well, if you're rich, $1,200, who cares? It doesn't matter. If you're making $25,000, $30,000 a year, that's a material increase in your costs. In addition, we're in an inflation environment, and this would be an easy way to knock, a 0.5 point off of U.S. inflation. So again, it's something which needs to be done. But clearly there is a toxic environment in Washington, which if you argue this policy is good for U.S. China relations, you're not going to succeed. If you argue this policy is good for the American people, you have a chance of succeeding. You may not succeed, but it's good for the American people. And my argument is constructive U.S. China relations is good for the American people. So when people say, I'm a friend of China, I say, these policies are good for the American people. And we never should lose sight of that. And I say that to the Biden administration. I said it to the Trump administration, but they didn't agree.
Yeah, I want to hear a little bit more because this is extremely important. And, we are hearing the Biden administration talking about the U.S. foreign policy needs to benefit the middle class. And I trust him that everything he is doing right now in terms of U.S. foreign policy is catering to that goal if he's really serious about it. Just now he talked about U.S. China relationship benefiting the particularly, low-income groups. But how do you see improved relations or stable relations between the two sides concretely benefiting the American middle class if it is handled properly?
Well, I think tariff reduction is one. I also think that you have to look at the overall strategic competition, that the way people to some degree in China, to some degree in Washington, are defining the relationship as the strategic competition. What does that mean? That means that we need to counter what the Chinese are doing strategically, what the Chinese government is doing. And the Chinese government will need to counter what the U.S. government is doing strategically. And that means that each government is going to need to allocate additional funding to defense expenditures. Now, there are winners, what I call the military-industrial complex in the United States, arms suppliers in China win from increased strategic competition between the United States and China. Who loses? The middle class and the poor people in the lower income people in the United States. They lose because that money, which is going to defense, would have been spent on infrastructure. It would have been spent on social programs. In China's case, it would have been spent on poverty alleviation. It would have been spent on other infrastructure developments. That it's a misallocation of resources that punishes the middle and lower income families in the United States. So people don't kind of recognize that this strategic competition, there are winners. There are people who win, but the majority of the publics in the United States and in China lose from this strategic competition. And not only do they lose for the misallocation of the expenses, they lose because it's harder to cooperate economically. It's harder to cooperate scientifically. It's harder to cooperate on pandemic prevention. It's harder to cooperate on climate change. That all these things that are real threats, it is harder to cooperate on because of the cost of this strategic competition. Now, I'm a minority view. But that does not mean I'm wrong, and that does not mean I'm going to abandon that view.
You know, maybe that is also why China has not been willing to define U.S. China relationship with the keyword of competition, although China does not deny that there is competition in between the two sides, but China has been reluctant to define this relationship. But if you listen to the discourse of the Biden administration, unfortunately, they seem to believe that this word competition comes before cooperation and of course before confrontation as well, and they keep talking about competition. So Mr. Orlins, what do you think of that? Do you think they understand the point that you were just making, that the fact that when you highlight strategic competition, you are actually going to mislocate your resources and cause negative income and negative consequences? And what is the difference, if there is, between what you mean by strategic competition and what they mean by competition? Do you think that when they talk about competition, they are talking about strategic competition?
I think they are. I think we should look at competition at three levels: the United States, China. This is the way I've historically looked at it. One is economic competition. It's fine to have economic competition. We compete, the United States competes with Canada, Mexico, UK, France, Japan. That's fine, no problem. Economic competition is fine. Diplomatic competition is okay. There are times that countries have different goals and they compete diplomatically to achieve their foreign policy goals, and that's okay. Strategic competition is dangerous, because it means that we need to spend not billions, not tens of billions, but hundreds of billions, ultimately trillions of dollars to defend against the other. And what is really the strategic conflict between the United States and China? And we need to answer what that is. And people need to understand, Americans need to understand Chinese history, Chinese culture, what the goals of the Chinese Communist Party are. I hear Americans talk about it, and it's often inconsistent with my understanding. But I think over time, we continue to educate, and we continue to try and persuade the Chinese government to take actions which reduce the tensions with the United States, whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it's in the East China Sea, whether it's activities with respect to BR Belt and Road Initiative or other things. That the Chinese government needs to understand how it is perceived in the world today. So you look at the countries around the world, and they are coming to the United States for protection. Why is that? It's because Chinese actions have pushed these countries to the United States. And they said, gosh, we really need your security umbrella. So the Chinese government needs to understand that some of its actions are pushing an alliance together to kind of not allow for the China to achieve its foreign policy goals. So it needs to rethink what those goals are and deal with the outside world in a way that it doesn't create that.
Well, I think China really values, U.S. China relations and really wants it to work. And we advise, we give whenever we can feedback, recommendations to our authorities as to how to better improve relations. And we try to do as much as we can on our daily show to, portray a truthful, a comprehensive picture and an open discussion as well, like we just had. But it's always great. It's always good to have these kind of conversation and to hear you talk about someone who has been so heavyweight in bilateral relations to talk about this. So thank you so much, Mr. Orlins, and I hope to have the opportunity in the future, not too distant. Yeah.
And I hope we get to do it in person soon.
I would love to. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I've been talking to Mr. Stephen Orlins, the President of the National Committee of U.S. China Relations. And that's it for this edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. Thanks for watching. You've got the point.